Snow whipped sideways through the mountain pass, and Alpha Rowan Draven was laughing. Frozen solid within the week, I'd wager. He said it to the lords riding beside him, his breath fogging in the cold. Someone had asked, not unkindly, whatever became of his first wife. No one walks into Frostfang territory with a cloak and a loaf of bread, and walks back out. She's bones under snow by now. The lords laughed, because that's what you did when the Alpha of Frost Hollow made a joke, even a cruel one, even about the woman who'd once balanced his ledgers until midnight. Then the iron doors of the Moon Sovereign Palace groaned open ahead of them, and the laughter died in every throat at once. Black-cloaked wolves flanked the entrance, silent as smoke, and in the center of the hall beyond, dressed in crimson velvet trimmed with black fur, a silver crown resting against dark hair, Serena. She didn't search the crowd for Rowan's face. King Thorn Valerius's gloved hand rested at her waist, not gripping, not steering, just present. The way a hand rests on something a man trusts will still be there tomorrow. Rowan's horse stopped walking before he told it to. Beside Thorn, towering half a head over every man in the hall, stood a king, rumored to have never lost a war he'd bothered to finish. Scarred jaw, silver eyes that missed nothing, the kind of stillness that made grown alphas lower their voices without meaning to. The lords flanking Rowan had gone quiet too, glancing between the crown on Serena's head and the man who'd told them, less than an hour ago, that she was worth nothing at all. She wasn't begging. She wasn't broken. She was standing beside the most feared king in Lycanor, like she'd always belonged there. 6 months ago, he'd watched her walk out of Frost Hollow's gates with nothing, certain the mountains would finish what he'd started. He'd been wrong about that. He was about to learn he'd been wrong about several other things too. 6 months earlier. In Lycanor, no one asked if a marriage was happy. They asked what it produced. Packs bowed to alphas, and alphas bowed, quietly, resentfully, to the handful of kings who held whole territories through strength alone. Chief among them was Thorn Valerius of Blackfang Dominion, a man so rarely seen smiling that rumor had stopped expecting it. They called him the Dead Wolf, because his enemies had a way of disappearing before their armies ever reached his border. Rowan wanted to be spoken of the same way. He'd built Frost Hollow into a pack worth respecting, through nerve, ambition, and the quiet labor of people smarter than him, though he'd never have put it that way. In his mind, Frost Hollow ran on his instincts. In truth, it ran on his wife. That morning, like most mornings, Serena had been awake since before dawn, checking grain stores against the ledger, drafting a letter to a merchant in the Eastern Valley who still owed them for winter wheat, quietly noting which border scouts hadn't been paid in 3 weeks. Last winter, when blight wiped out half the southern wheat fields, she'd gone 3 sleepless nights rerouting trade agreements, so no one in Frost Hollow went without bread. Rowan gave a speech that spring about the pack's resilience. He never once asked how the granaries had stayed full. Rowan didn't know about the unpaid scouts. He didn't know about most of it. He only knew that Frost Hollow kept running, and he'd long since stopped asking why. Serena had never wanted to be a warrior. She'd wanted to be necessary, which she'd mistaken, for 6 years, for being loved. So when he told her, while adjusting a buckle on his vambrace, not even looking up, that Lord Varric's daughter would be joining the pack as his new wife, Serena set down the ledger in her hands very, very carefully. She brings 500 soldiers, Rowan said, like he was reading off a supply manifest. That's what Frost Hollow needs right now. Strength. I gave you stability for 6 years. Ideas don't defend a border. Neither, Serena said quietly, do empty granaries. He didn't answer that. He didn't understand it well enough to. So my loyalty, she said, has become inconvenient. I need strength, Serena. He said it like an apology. It wasn't one. Pack law is clear. You have until nightfall. 6 years, settled in an afternoon. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She packed a cloak, a flint, and a heel of stale bread, because that was all pack law required him to give her. And Rowan, to his credit or his shame, She genuinely couldn't say which anymore. Didn't try to give her more. The gates of Frost Hollow shut behind her, with a sound like a verdict. The Frostfang range did not forgive mistakes. Her boots had never been made for mountain travel. By the second day, they'd frozen stiff overnight, and she stopped being able to feel her toes sometime around noon. She told herself she wasn't crying about Rowan. She was crying because she'd spent 6 years believing that being useful was the same as being wanted, and no one had corrected her until it was far too late to matter. By the third day, her feet had gone from aching to silent, which some distant, clinical part of her understood was worse. The wind stopped feeling cold and started feeling like nothing at all. She didn't decide to stop walking. Her legs decided for her, and the snow rose up to meet her, soft as something that wanted to keep her. Through the white haze, she heard wolves, not one, many, circling close, silent, enormous. Frost Hollow's wolves ran half this size. The largest shifted an arm's length from her face. A man rose out of the snow instead, scarred, silver-eyed, entirely unhurried, as though the cold killing her couldn't touch him at all. Serena had heard stories about the dead wolf her whole life. None of them had mentioned that he'd catch her before she hit the ground. Serena woke to warmth, which was how she knew she'd probably died. The last thing she remembered was snow rising to meet her like something that wanted to keep her. Now there was a low fire in a stone hearth, wolf pelts heavy across her legs, and the ache of returning feeling spreading up through both feet, painful in a way that meant, unfortunately, she was still alive to feel it. She sat up too fast. The room tilted. When it steadied, she saw him. He sat near the door, not the fire, as if he'd chosen the coldest seat in the room on purpose. Scarred, silent, watching her with an attention that felt less like a threat and more like an accountant checking a sum. She braced for the question she'd have asked. In his place. Who are you? Whose mate were you? What pack do I need to burn down for leaving you half dead on my mountain? Instead, he said, what can you do? Serena blinked. What? You heard me. I don't. She pulled the pelts tighter, feeling suddenly, absurdly, underdressed for an interrogation. You're not going to ask who I am. I know who you are. Frost Hollow's steward walked out with nothing but a cloak, and Draven didn't send anyone after her. That tells me what I need to know about him. His silver eyes didn't move off her face. It tells me nothing about you, so what can you do? No one had ever asked her that first. I can read a ledger faster than any clerk you have, she said, because it was true, and because some stubborn part of her needed him to know it. I can see a bad harvest coming 2 seasons before it hits. I can talk a merchant down 11% and have him thank me for it. Something in his face didn't quite become a smile. Good, he said, and left. She was given a room, plain clothes, and, pointedly, no guard at her door, which told her more about Blackfang than any speech could have. By the second day, walking the fortress halls on feet that had mostly forgiven her, Serena understood why people called this the Dead Wolf's Kingdom, and meant it as respect, not only fear. Soldiers here didn't hold formation because someone was watching. They held it because sloppiness got people killed, and everyone here had clearly decided they preferred living. Workers moved with the particular efficiency of people who weren't performing industriousness for a noble's benefit. Watch rotations changed on schedules she couldn't quite predict, which she suspected was the point. And the outer walls were patrolled by soldiers who looked unnervingly like they were hoping for a reason to use their swords. No one asked whose daughter she was. No one seemed to care. Titles, she was beginning to understand, meant very little in Blackfang. Results meant everything, which made the Treasury office, when she finally found it, almost funny. The ledgers were a disaster. Contradicting categories, 3 systems layered over one another like sediment, a column of grain shipments that simply stopped being recorded 4 months ago and never resumed. A kingdom this disciplined, quietly bleeding grain through paperwork no one had bothered to fix. She waited for a steward who never came, so she picked up a pen instead. By the time anyone noticed her, she'd reconciled a full quarter's trade ledger, error by error, into something that actually balanced. The clerk who found her went pale and fetched someone. That someone fetched Thorn. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at the corrected ledger, then at her. You did this while waiting. There wasn't anything else to do. He didn't ask why she hadn't simply sat still like anyone else would have. She got the sense he already knew. That stillness had never come naturally to her. That organizing things was what she did with her hands when the rest of her felt like it was coming apart. He studied her a moment longer than the ledger warranted, the way a man studies something he's deciding whether to trust. The grain inventories haven't been properly counted in months, he said. You'll take over reconciling them. Behind him, a steward made a strangled sound. My king, she's an outsider. She was exiled from. She balanced a quarter's books in an afternoon. In a chair, waiting to learn whether she'd live or die. Thorne said, without raising his voice, without looking away from Serena. What have you balanced this week? The steward didn't answer. Thorne didn't wait for one. It took her 4 days to find it. 4 days of cross-referencing shipment manifests against granary counts, storehouse against storehouse, season against season. The same careful, patient work that had once kept an entire pack fed without anyone noticing her doing it. By the 4th night, working alone by lamplight with the fortress gone quiet around her, Serena set down her pen and stared at the final number until it stopped looking like a mistake and started looking like what it actually was. Grain enough to feed an army. Recorded as delivered, recorded as stored, and simply, quietly, not there. Someone inside Blackfang had been stealing from the dead wolf, carefully enough, for long enough, that no one had caught it. She thought of the shipment column that stopped, conveniently, exactly 4 months ago. Whoever had done this knew the ledgers well enough to know precisely where to stop looking believable, which meant they were still here, still trusted. Until now. She didn't wait for morning. She found Thorne in the war room, alone, studying a map of the northern border by candlelight, and set the ledger down in front of him, without preamble. Someone has been stealing from you for at least 4 months, possibly longer. She pointed to the column that stopped cold in early spring. Grain shipments recorded as delivered, that never arrived. I cross-referenced it against the tax rolls next. 3 estates have been underreporting yields to the same degree, almost to the coin, which isn't the kind of coincidence honest men produce. And the military requisitions for the eastern garrison, she flipped to a marked page, have been padded by nearly a 1/5 for 6 months running. Someone's skimming 3 different ways at once, and they've been careful enough to make it look like ordinary incompetence. Thorne read in silence, long enough that she started counting his breaths. You found this in 4 days, he said finally. I had motivation. Boredom mostly. That wasn't quite a smile, but it was close enough that a passing guard nearly missed his footing. There are 3 of them, Thorne said. You want them hanged in the courtyard by morning. Not a question, but she answered anyway. Hang them, and whoever's above them, simply find someone new who's better at hiding it. Public executions teach people to steal more carefully, not to stop stealing. So what do you want instead? Let them think they're still undetected. Feed them a shipment that only exists on paper. 1 route, 1 date, 1 convenient gap in the patrol schedule. Whoever moves on it hangs themselves without you lifting a blade. He was quiet a moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do yet. He laughed. Once, low, more surprised out of him than offered. Remind me never to make you angry. You couldn't afford it, she said. I do your taxes now. The trap worked exactly as she'd described. 3 men, a steward, a garrison quartermaster, a tax collector trusted for a decade, walked into an empty warehouse at midnight and found Thorne's soldiers waiting, instead of an empty road. No executions, no spectacle, just quiet removal, and a kingdom that ran a little cleaner by the following week. The soldiers who doubted her stopped doubting out loud. After that, something shifted, quietly, the way seasons do. She started staying later in the war room than her work required, and so did he. There was usually tea by the 2nd hour. She never saw who brought it, only that it appeared exactly the way she liked it, without her ever once mentioning a preference aloud. One night, she found his battle cloak, with a torn seam draped over a chair, and mended it, without asking, because her hands needed something to do, while he argued logistics with a general twice her age. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He simply wore it the next morning, like it had always been that way. Another night, well past midnight, she asked him why he never explained his decisions to his generals. Only issued them. Explaining invites debate, he said. Debate costs time I don't have in a war. It also costs you loyalty. Men follow orders. They fight for reasons. He didn't answer that night. 3 weeks later, she caught him laying out the reasoning behind a border decision to his council for the first time in his reign, and pretended not to notice him glance at her afterward, checking whether she had. "You're using whom incorrectly," she told him once, reading a treaty draft upside down from across the table. "I am the king. Kings can still be wrong about grammar." He looked up at her for a long moment. The specific, unhurried way he looked at things he was deciding whether to keep. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackfang, Thorn Valerius actually smiled. Not the almost smile, the real one. The guard by the door dropped his spear. It frightened her more than the corruption had. She recognized the shape of what was happening, because she'd built her first marriage on the same foundation, made herself useful, and called it safety. And the safety had lasted exactly as long as she'd stayed useful. She didn't know how to want something without immediately calculating what it would cost to lose it. "You don't have to stay," Thorn said one evening, without her having said anything at all. He had a way of answering questions before she asked them, which she was beginning to suspect was its own kind of intelligence. "Not to earn a place here." "You already have one." "Then why would I stay?" "Because you choose to," he said. "Not because anyone requires it of you. I won't be another cage with better furniture." She didn't answer him that night, but she didn't leave either. Word of the warehouse spread faster than either of them expected. Not the trap itself, but the woman behind it. Within a month, messengers began arriving from packs Blackfang had never bothered courting. A request for advice on grain reserves, a plea to review a neighboring lord's trade agreement, a careful formal letter addressed not to King Thorn Valerius, but to Lady Serena of Blackfang. She read that last one twice. No one had ever addressed anything to her by name before, not once, in 6 years, as anyone's wife. She was starting to understand she didn't need to be. Winter turned to spring, and spring turned into something Blackfang hadn't seen in a generation: abundance. Grain reserves that once ran dangerously thin through the cold months now carried surplus into planting season. Trade routes Serena had personally renegotiated brought merchants north who'd never bothered with Blackfang before, drawn by fair terms, and a treasury that, for the first time anyone could remember, actually balanced. Crime in the lower districts dropped by half, not from harsher punishment, but because a kingdom where people were paid on time and fed through winter had less reason to steal. Neighboring kings who'd once valued Thorn only for his army began sending envoys instead of soldiers, asking, carefully, what Blackfang was doing differently. No one said her name in those meetings. Everyone in the room knew it anyway. Frost Hollow told a different story. Lord Varric's daughter had brought 500 soldiers to the marriage, exactly as promised. She had not brought the ability to read a supply manifest, negotiate a grain price, or notice when a store's keeper was quietly padding his own pockets. Within a season, shortages Serena would have caught in a week went unnoticed for months. Merchants who'd once trusted Frost Hollow's credit began demanding payment up front, then stopped showing up at all. Debt piled onto debt. Rowan blamed poor harvests. He blamed bad luck. He blamed, once, in a private moment he'd have denied to anyone who asked, the absence of a woman he'd been so certain was worth nothing. He did not yet know where she'd landed. He would. Back in Blackfang, Serena noticed something Thorn clearly hoped she wouldn't. He'd stopped sleeping properly. Council sessions ran later every week. He ate standing up, when he remembered to eat at all, and twice she'd found him still at his desk past midnight, the candle burned down to nothing, a half-finished letter under his hand. A kingdom didn't run itself just because it was finally running well. Someone still had to hold all of it, every night, alone. So she stopped asking, and simply started bringing him dinner herself, setting it down without comment, the way the tea used to appear for her. He never mentioned it. But she noticed he started working later, specifically on the evenings she was slow to come, as if some part of him had learned to wait. The night it finally rained, A real spring storm, loud against the fortress windows. She found him staring at a map he clearly wasn't reading. "I know how to win wars," he said, without her asking. "I've known it since I was young enough that no one else had to teach me. Strategy, patience, where to strike and when to hold." He looked up at her. "I don't know how to build peace. I've never had to." "Peace is simply another campaign," Serena said, sitting across from him. "You still need supply lines. You still need to know your enemy. Except now your enemy is famine, or corruption, or a bad harvest, and your soldiers are merchants and farmers instead of men with swords. You've been fighting this war for months. You just didn't recognize the terrain." He didn't answer for a long moment. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the corrected ledger, that very first day, like something he was still deciding whether he could trust. Except this time, she understood. It wasn't the ledger he was studying. It was her. He didn't say the word that night. He wasn't a man who spent words he hadn't fully earned the right to say yet. But something in his chest had shifted a full degree off its axis, quietly and permanently, the way ice shifts before it breaks. And he recognized it, with the same unhurried clarity he brought to everything else, for exactly what it was. 3 weeks later, he summoned every alpha in the Northern Territories to Blackfang's Great Hall. Serena stood at the back, as she always did in formal court, expecting nothing more than another trade council. Instead, Thorn rose from his throne, and the hall went silent the way it always did for him. Except this time, he hadn't come to discuss borders. "For a year, every one of you has asked when I intend to choose a queen," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest wall. "I will not choose a queen." Murmurs. Someone near the front laughed, uncertain, before catching his expression and stopping. "I have already found my equal." He looked directly at Serena, and for once didn't bother hiding it from the room. "I'm not asking you to be my wife," he said, quieter now, though the hall had gone so still, every word still carried. Frost Hollow tried that, and called it ownership. "I'm asking you to be my partner, in the crown, in the kingdom, in everything I build from here forward. Built with you, or not built at all." Every alpha in the hall was staring at her. Serena thought of a ledger she hadn't been asked to fix. She'd fixed it anyway, because it was who she was. And for the first time in her life, someone was asking for exactly that. Not her obedience, not her silence, just her. "Yes," she said. The hall erupted. Thorn didn't smile at the noise. He smiled at her. By the time the first snow returned to the north, Frost Hollow was a kingdom in name only. The harvest had failed for the second year running. Poor soil management, poorer planning, and a granary system no one had properly maintained since Serena left. Half the pack's stores had already been sold to cover debts that kept multiplying faster than anyone could track them. Children in the lower village had started going to bed hungry, a fact Rowan learned not from his own stewards, who'd stopped reporting bad news months ago, but from a mother who cornered him outside the hall and refused to move until he looked at her. He'd tried, in his own way, to fix things. He'd shouted at stewards. He'd replaced 2 of them. It hadn't occurred to him, even then, that shouting had never once been what kept Frost Hollow fed. That the woman who'd done it for 6 years had done it so quietly he'd mistaken her competence for something that simply happened on its own. Lord Varrick's daughter, his wife of a year, sat through council meetings without contributing a single useful word. She hadn't been raised to run a kingdom. She'd been raised to marry into one. Then, Lord Varrick himself withdrew his support entirely, pulled his soldiers, cancelled the grain shipments he'd promised as part of the marriage contract, and sent a letter making it clear a failing pack wasn't the alliance he'd signed on for. Rowan had one option left, and he hated it more than he'd ever hated anything. Travel north, to the one kingdom wealthy enough to save Frost Hollow, and beg. He almost enjoyed the ride, if he was honest with himself. It gave him something to laugh about besides the debt. "You remember my first wife," he said to the lords riding with him, several of whom did, vaguely. "Sent her walking into Frostfang territory with a loaf of bread. I always wondered whether she found work as someone's kitchen girl, or froze before she got the chance." He grinned, the particular grin of a man trying to convince himself He still had the upper hand in something. Wouldn't that be something? Begging King Thorn for grain, and finding Serena scrubbing his floors. The advisors laughed, obligingly, the way men laugh at the jokes of someone whose favor they still need. One offered that she'd probably married some lesser Blackfang steward for a roof over her head, if she'd survived at all. Rowan liked that idea. It made the 6 years he'd spent married to her feel smaller, somehow, if her whole life after him had shrunk down to nothing. He was still laughing when the mountain pass opened onto Blackfang's outer road, and the fortress came into view for the first time. Vast, black-stoned, banners cracking in the wind. His laughter didn't survive the doors. The iron doors of the great hall groaned open, and every voice in Rowan's delegation died at once. Black-cloaked wolves lined the entrance, silent, disciplined, nothing like Frost Hollow's guard. Beyond them, King Thorn Valerius sat upon a throne, carved from black stone, exactly as fearsome as every story claimed. Scarred, silver-eyed, radiating the particular stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. And beside him, not behind him, not beneath him, beside him, on a throne of her own, sat a woman in crimson velvet, trimmed with black fur, a silver crown resting against dark hair Rowan would have recognized anywhere, in any life. Serena. She wasn't scrubbing anyone's floors. She wasn't anyone's kitchen girl. She sat with the unhurried composure of someone who had been ruling for a very long time, and Thorn's hand rested at her waist with the easy familiarity of a man who touched her like that every day, without needing to think about it. She looked at Rowan, the way she might look at a stranger's unpaid invoice. Not with hatred, not even with satisfaction, with mild, professional interest. "Alpha Draven," Thorn said, his voice filling the hall without effort. "I understand you've come to discuss grain." Serena watched Rowan's face do the arithmetic. The crown, the throne, the 6 months, the 500 soldiers he'd traded her for, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite peace. It was simply the truth, finally arriving somewhere it could be seen. No one in Rowan's delegation made a sound. The advisors who'd laughed about kitchen girls an hour ago now stared at the floor, unwilling to meet Serena's eyes. Rowan's mouth had gone completely dry. 6 months ago, he'd told a hall full of lords that ideas didn't defend a border, that his wife's only value was in what she could produce for someone else's army. Now the woman he'd exiled with a loaf of bread sat crowned beside the one king in Lycanor. No one dared cross, and he had walked 300 miles specifically to ask her for mercy. "Serena," he managed. She said nothing. She simply waited, the way she used to wait for him to notice the granaries were empty. Patient, unbothered, entirely unsurprised it had taken him this long. Rowan felt something in his chest cave in, slow and total, like ice giving way beneath a boot. What have I done? He thought. And then, because it was true, and because for once no one was laughing, what have I done? They didn't negotiate in the great hall. Thorn kept a smaller room for that. A long table, a fire, no throne, no audience beyond a scribe in the corner, and the 3 advisors Rowan had brought, who now sat as far from Serena as the room allowed. Rowan hadn't slept properly in 3 days. It showed. Rowan asked for grain first, because it was the easiest thing to ask for. Then money, to cover the debts Lord Varric had walked away from. Then, with visible reluctance, soldiers, enough to hold Frost Hollow's borders, until the pack could stand on its own again. "That's a significant request," Thorn said, and said almost nothing else for the rest of the meeting. Serena had a stack of papers in front of her, and she went through them without raising her voice once. "In the 11 months since I left," she said, "Frost Hollow's grain reserves were flagged by your own steward 4 separate times. Here." She slid a letter across the table, dated, signed, ignored. "He recommended reducing exports to build a buffer against a poor harvest. You rejected it in favor of a trade deal with Lord Varric that expired the same season it started paying out." Rowan opened his mouth. She continued before he could use it. "The Eastern Mill needed repairs 8 months ago. The request sat on your desk for 6 weeks before your new steward, the one who replaced the man who used to bring you these requests, decided it wasn't urgent. That steward, I should mention, is Lord Varric's cousin. He was promoted the same week. 3 capable stewards were quietly let go. Another paper. None of them had ties to Varric's family. All of them had warned you about something you didn't want to hear. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Each page landed like a verdict being read aloud. "You can't blame every failed decision on me leaving," Rowan said, finally finding his voice. "Kingdoms have bad years. Harvests fail everywhere." "They do," Serena agreed. She slid one more paper across the table, a comparison of Frost Hollow's harvest yields against 3 neighboring packs over the same 11 months. 2 of these 3 also had poor harvests. Both recovered within a season, because both still had the grain reserves your steward warned you about. Bad years happen to everyone, Rowan. Collapse only happens to kingdoms that weren't prepared for one. Rowan didn't try to argue again. Your treasury shows 4 separate loans taken against future harvests, to cover the wedding, the hall renovations, and a debt to a southern arms dealer for weapons you never used. Your military spending doubled the year you had the least reason to fight anyone. She looked up at him for the first time since she'd started. You didn't lose Frost Hollow to bad luck, Rowan. You lost it one ignored warning at a time. The room had gone completely silent. Even Rowan's advisors, who'd laughed about kitchen girls a day ago, had nothing left to say. Thorn hadn't spoken in several minutes. He didn't need to. Watching him do nothing but let Serena speak was, Rowan understood distantly, its own kind of verdict. A king so certain of his queen's judgment that he felt no need to add his own. It was worse than if Thorn had shouted at him. Far worse. "Blackfang will provide grain and a loan to settle your debts," Serena said finally, setting the papers down. "Thorn will also send soldiers to hold your borders through the winter." Something in Rowan's chest loosened, just slightly. In exchange, Frost Hollow's trade routes, tax collection, and military appointments will be reviewed and approved by Blackfang for the next 5 years. She let that settle. You'll keep your title, you'll keep your seat, but you will not make another decision of consequence without oversight, because you've demonstrated, repeatedly, and at considerable cost to people who trusted you, that you shouldn't be making them alone. It wasn't an alliance. It was a leash, dressed in formal language, and everyone in the room understood it. Rowan thought of the mother outside his hall, the hungry children, the granaries he'd never once thought to check. He signed. Later, riding back through the same mountain pass he'd laughed his way through a week earlier, Rowan finally let himself understand what he'd refused to for 11 months. Every warning Serena had shown him today, she had once handled herself, quietly, without credit, before he'd ever had reason to notice a problem existed. The mill repairs, the trade timing, the stewards who actually did their jobs. She hadn't been managing his kingdom in the background out of duty. She had been the reason there'd never been a reckoning like this one before. He'd called it nothing. He'd called it a quiet voice and a knack for sums. He understood now, far too late to matter, that he had been married to the only thing standing between Frost Hollow and exactly this. Somewhere behind him, soldiers from Blackfang were already unloading grain into stores she wasn't there to fill. He didn't know if he'd ever get to thank her for that. He wasn't certain he deserved to try. The Raven arrived before dawn, its wings dusted with frost, Lord Varric's broken seal still dark with fresh wax. Inside, a single line. "The treaty is an insult. Blackfang will answer for it." By midday, scouts confirmed what the letter promised. Varric hadn't simply refused the terms. He had spent the weeks since building something out of his humiliation. 3 territories had answered his call, drawn in by promises of land, plunder, and the satisfying end of the wolf who rules with parchment instead of claws. Thorn read the message twice, then summoned his generals. Maps unrolled across the war room table within the hour. Commanders who had followed him through a dozen conquests began marking supply lines, calculating how many days it would take 4,000 fighters to reach the eastern border. "We have the stronger force," General Cade said. "We always have." "There won't be a battle," Serena said. The room went still. Cade turned first, more amused than offended. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. Lord Varric is already marching. He's posturing," she said. "An army needs 3 things to hold together: food, pay, and belief. Take away any one, and it stops being an army. It becomes hungry men standing in the snow, waiting for someone to tell them why they're still there. Thorn watched her the way he always did when she spoke, like a man recalculating something he thought he'd already solved. "Explain," he said. He never needed more than one word from her, so she did. Freeze the trade routes his allies depended on, quietly, through contracts rather than blockades. Blackfang's grain redirected to other buyers overnight. Buy up the debts his lesser lords owed southern merchants, until those debts, and the leverage attached to them, belonged to the crown instead. Reroute the caravans that once supplied his allies toward friendlier markets, so warehouses meant to feed an army sat empty. Cut the mercenary companies off from their paymasters in the south, and offer better terms to any captain willing to walk away first. And quietly, privately, send separate peace terms to Varric's smaller allies, so that within weeks, every lord in his alliance would wonder if the others had already made their own arrangements behind his back. "No swords," she said. "Just patience." Cade looked to the king, waiting for him to override her, to choose the war his enemies expected, and his generals were already preparing for. Thorn only nodded once. "Do it." Weeks passed. At first, nothing seemed to change. Varric's banners still gathered at the border. His generals still postured for the scouts who reported back to Blackfang each evening. Then the cracks began. A mercenary captain, 3 weeks unpaid, marched his company home, rather than starve for a war that had never been his. A minor lord who had pledged wheat to the alliance found his granaries emptying faster than the season explained, his merchants somehow always finding better prices elsewhere. Soldiers promised plunder started asking their captains uncomfortable questions about supply wagons that arrived half full or didn't arrive at all. Serena tracked it from a small room lined with ledgers, using the same quiet discipline that had once saved a dying pack to dismantle an army no one had touched. "They're starving," she told Thorn one evening, setting a report on the table between them. "Not from siege, from arithmetic." He studied her for a long moment. "I've spent my life learning how to break men with steel, and I've spent mine learning how to break them without it." He almost smiled. Almost. By the 6th week, 2 of Varric's 3 allied territories had quietly withdrawn their forces, citing debts suddenly called due, and shortages no one could quite explain. The alliance built to end Blackfang's rule was dissolving in empty storehouses and unpaid ledgers, exactly as Serena had known it would. Lord Varric would not accept it quietly. Another raven arrived, this one addressed not to King Thorn, but to Serena herself. The seal was cracked, pressed too hard, as though the hand that closed it had been shaking with fury, rather than ceremony. Inside, only a few lines. "You believe ink and grain can defeat me. You are mistaken. Meet me at the border stones, Queen of Blackfang. Bring your king, bring your ledgers, bring whatever weapon you believe in. I will end this myself, before every ally who abandoned me, so they remember exactly what happens to those who cross Lord Varric." Serena read it once, then again. She set it down beside the reports that had, week by week, unmade an army without costing a single life. "He wants his war," she said quietly. Thorn stood beside her, silver eyes fixed on the letter. "Then we'll give him something else." The border stones stood exactly where they always had, 2 weathered pillars marking the line between kingdoms, old enough that no one remembered which king had raised them. On one side, Blackfang's army, disciplined ranks stretching into the tree line, banners unmoving in the cold air. On the other, Lord Varric's remaining forces, fewer than the scouts had promised, thinner than his letters had boasted. Rowan stood near the rear of Blackfang's ranks, dressed in the plain colors of a vassal lord, rather than an alpha. He had been summoned, not invited. A reminder, Thorn had made clear, that Frost Hollow's fate was tied to whatever happened here. Varric rode forward alone, his cloak dark red, his voice carrying easily across the frozen field. "I see you brought your king," he called to Serena. "And your ledgers, I assume, are safely tucked away somewhere warm." Laughter rippled through his ranks, thin laughter, the kind that came from men trying to convince themselves they still had something to laugh about. Serena rode forward, unarmed, Thorn beside her, silent as always. "I brought something better than ledgers," she said. "I brought the truth. She raised her hand. A rider from Blackfang's side approached and set a wooden case before Varric's horse. "Every debt financing this campaign," Serena said. "Every loan your mercenaries were promised repayment from. Every contract your nobles signed, believing your treasury could cover it. I own all of it now. Have for 6 weeks." Varric's smile faltered. "You're bluffing. Ask your captains." She didn't need to say more. A murmur was already spreading through the ranks behind him. Men who had gone weeks unpaid finally hearing why. The first defection came within minutes. The mercenary captain who had marched his company home rode forward from a stand of trees, where he'd been waiting all morning. He dismounted, not to challenge Varric, but to hand over a folded contract. "My company's owed to the crown that holds our debt now," he said, "not to you." One by one, others followed. A noble who had pledged his soldiers quietly turned his banner east, toward home, toward a harvest he couldn't afford to lose again. Then another, then a third. Varric spun in his saddle, shouting orders no one obeyed anymore. His voice, once enough to command armies, dissolved into the wind. Not a single sword had been drawn. Rowan watched from the rear, and for the first time in months, felt something colder than the wind on his face. He remembered dismissing Serena's ledgers as though they were beneath him. Remembered telling her, once, that ideas didn't defend borders. He watched an entire army disappear because of one. The greatest weapon was never steel, he thought. It was her. Varric was alone now, his remaining loyalists too few to matter, his campaign undone by paper and patience instead of blood. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice had lost its certainty. "It is," Serena said, not unkindly. "You built an alliance on fear and promises you couldn't keep. I simply waited for the arithmetic to catch up to you." Varric said nothing more. He turned his horse and rode from the field, trailed by the handful of men still willing to follow him, leaving the border stones exactly as they'd always been, silent, and now, finally, quiet. Thorn turned to Serena as the last of Varric's banners disappeared over the ridge. The entire court had gathered close enough to hear. "I've won every battle with steel," he said, quiet enough that it felt like it belonged only to her, and loud enough that everyone heard it anyway. "You won this one with wisdom." Then, before generals, before nobles, before Rowan standing frozen among the ranks, King Thorn Valerius, the dead wolf, the man who never wasted words, leaned down and pressed his lips to Serena's forehead. No one laughed this time. No one dared. Rowan came to Blackfang alone this time. No delegation. No pride to hide behind. Just a man in a plain traveling cloak, standing at the same gates he had once walked through mocking her. He asked to see Serena, not the queen, just Serena. She met him in the garden rather than the throne room. No crown between them, no court watching. "I'm not here for grain," he said, "or soldiers, or mercy I haven't earned." "Then why are you here?" "To apologize." He looked older than she remembered, worn thin by a year of consequences. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted peace between us, before I stopped being an alpha at all." Serena was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who had once reduced 6 years of loyalty to an afternoon's packing. "I forgive you," she said finally. Something in his shoulders loosened, like a weight he'd carried the whole journey north had finally set down. Then she added, gently, "But I'm not coming back. There was never a version of this where I would." "I wasn't asking that. I know. I just wanted it said plainly, so neither of us wonders." He nodded, accepting it the way a man accepts weather. "You mistook my kindness for weakness," Serena said. "I mistook your ambition for love. We were both wrong." Rowan didn't argue. There was nothing left in him to argue with. Within the month, he relinquished his authority over Frost Hollow entirely, handing the pack to a steward, known more for patience than pride. A man who listened to his people, the way Serena once had, who understood that granaries mattered more than glory. Frost Hollow began to heal, slowly, the way land does after a long winter. Its people finally prospered, not because of the alpha who once ruled them, but in spite of him. Rowan lived quietly at its edges, no longer feared, no longer followed, finally understanding that the kingdom he'd spent his life chasing had been standing beside him the whole time, keeping his ledgers. Blackfang entered an age no one in Lycanor had seen before. Serena built schools where pups of every rank learned to read contracts as easily as they learned to fight. She founded trade academies that trained merchants and stewards from packs who had once been considered too small to matter. She established winter reserves so thorough that famine, the thing that had once broken Rowan's kingdom, became a word Blackfang's children only heard in stories. She created diplomatic councils where rival alphas negotiated with words instead of wolves, a practice other kingdoms mocked at first, then quietly copied. Neighboring packs sent envoys not for military alliance, but for her counsel. Her ideas, patient, unglamorous, relentlessly practical, spread further than any army Thorn had ever led, reshaping the continent one granary, one treaty, one school at a time. They said the dead wolf had built the strongest kingdom through fear. They were wrong about that too. He had simply had the sense to marry the woman who could build something fear could never hold. On a clear morning months later, Serena stood on the palace balcony, watching dawn spread gold over rooftops that no longer feared winter, over granaries that stayed full, over a kingdom that had stopped being merely feared and started being envied for the right reasons. Thorn joined her, silent as he always was in the mornings, his hand finding hers without needing to look. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, not turning from the view, choosing a woman who won wars with ledgers instead of claws. He considered the question the way he considered everything, slowly and completely. "Kings conquer kingdoms," he said. "You taught me how to make one worth ruling." She smiled, leaning into him as the sun climbed higher over Blackfang. They stood together as the light spread across the valley, no longer merely a king and his queen, but two people who had built something neither could have built alone, a kingdom raised not on conquest, but on the quiet, unshakable partnership between a man who had never known peace and a woman who had finally found a home worth keeping. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.